Hello and welcome to another one of the Young Advisors podcast, Let's Get Mental series. Today we have the third in our diagnoses sub-series and the episode will be titled Service versus User. So I'm your host for today, Ollie, and I'm joined by another young advisor, Bry.
Hello.
As well as our extra special guest, I almost said guest judge, our extra special guest, Anne-Marie, who is a GP by background, but currently is undertaking sort of a larger scale improvement role. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that, Anne-Marie?
Yes, hi there, Ollie, and hi, Bry. It's lovely to talk to you today. Yes, my role is as Deputy Medical Director for NHS England Improvement in the Midlands, and I do have quite a large portfolio, but one of the areas in particular that I'm working in is on the transformation and improvement for mental health services and also learning disabilities and autism. So it's also, I perhaps ought to say, it's a really important area for me as well, because personally I've had close family members who have had significant mental health. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to your listeners today.
Fab, and we're really excited to have you here, so thank you very much for joining us. So yes, we'll just dive straight in. So as we discussed in previous ones, we've had a little look in terms of the diagnosis series around what it is, what constitutes it, sort of some different approaches we have, as well as the language. But today I thought we could start off the topic by discussing sort of who we think is the expert. So who do we think should have, I guess, the final say in inverted commas? Is there anyone who we think should have, I guess, the final word in? Should it be the parent? Should it be the service user? Should it be a therapist, counsellor, mental health worker who knows someone well? And we're just thought we could open it up by having a little chat around this topic. I know it can be quite difficult when there is professional disagreement or disagreement between a service user or a service user's parent with their services. So it could be good to analyse this a bit further. So if we start with you, Anne-Marie, if that's all right.
Yeah.
If we're saying who is the expert, who is the final say, I guess, would you say that anyone has the most important voice when it comes to mental health services?
So I suppose I would say I feel it should be a collaborative approach. I think, having been on both sides of the equation, I think it's really important that both the expert and the person themselves, the patient, the client, however you want to describe them, I think both sides should work together to reach a diagnosis that is the one that both feel is appropriate for that person. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes people feel that they are overdiagnosed, and we can talk maybe later about the implications of being overdiagnosed and over-medicalised, and of course there are lots of implications. And then other people often feel that they are underdiagnosed. I've had patients who are very frustrated that, for example, they can't get a diagnosis of autism. Not only is it difficult to access the service, but then when they do, they're told, well, we think maybe you could have autism, we'll give you a working diagnosis of autism, but we're not going to diagnose you fully with autism. We're going to wait and see what happens in the process of time. Or another good example is ADHD. I'm sure many people who have been on that journey to try and access the services around ADHD will know that, first of all, it's difficult to get into the system, and then when you do, there's again a feeling from the experts that there's a reluctance to provide a label. And so for me, I think, just to sum up really, I think it should be collaborative. I think it should be that both sides have the chance to discuss the pros and cons of a diagnosis. I think the final, if you like, label, and I hate to use that word, but I think the final label probably needs to be given by a psychiatrist, but only because it adds an official stamp, and that in itself opens a lot of doors. So for example, if you have a diagnosis formally from a psychiatrist, It may well mean that you're then able to register yourself as disabled, and it means then that you have access to certain benefits, and you have maybe more support through the educational system and things like that. So I think the final labelling should come from a psychiatrist, but the journey to get to that should be a collaborative one from the person involved and of course their family and carers, as well as the professionals.
Very well put. I think you've managed to touch on a lot of important bases there, and yes, coming back to sort of this recurring theme almost, I guess the role of the psychiatrist, the role of the official in inverted commas diagnosis term, and how useful it is and isn't. I guess it's also important, like you said, I guess with the working diagnosis, I guess it's how much of an effect that can have on someone. Does that offer them that further insight into themselves? Does it offer them access to local therapies or mental health services, or do they need to take it any steps further? And I guess then on the flip side, if it's not as what people wanted to, if that's then prohibiting you, does the parent then get involved? And I think that's definitely one of the issues, is sort of maybe the risk of disempowering the service user. And I don't think it's the case by any means for all services, but I do think that we do risk, especially when looking at sort of children and young people's services, when people are more anxious around accessing it, between discussing these quite personal elements of their lives, they can risk maybe not being heard or maybe not being quite understood correctly. And I think that can potentially become quite a dangerous issue as well if clinicians aren't potentially able to always listen 100% to what someone is trying to say to them. And it can be very easy, I guess, to get caught up in these workloads. But I guess looking back at this issue of disempowerment, I guess we could say there is some, not necessarily stigma, but maybe preconceptions that a lot of people might have around young people, around the maybe not knowing themselves as well, or maybe the fact that they're not sort of trained clinically, or maybe that they're sort of, I know especially in the age of technology, there's sort of this ongoing trend of Googling to try and diagnose yourself, and then maybe getting very hooked up on finding these certain terms and getting it wrong. But equally, people can know themselves very well. So to sort of round it up to a question to ask, do you think, I guess, does being younger make your opinion less reliable? Do service users still need to be informed and taken into consideration?
Absolutely. Oh gosh, yeah. And I would say that most people, most patients these days, whether they be 8, 18 or 80, are far more knowledgeable than they ever were when I first went to medical school. I mean, anecdotally, I can tell you that I used to examine patients when I first qualified, and you'd be feeling their tummy and you'd say, oh, what operation did you have here? You know, you've got a huge scar that's going from one side of your body to the other. And they would say, oh, I don't know. You know, and that's how uninformed people used to be, and it's not that long ago. And I used to think, how can you not know what operation you had? How can you not know what organ or what piece of your body somebody not only operated on but probably took out as well? And that is literally how uninformed people used to be. Whereas nowadays, as you say, people have access to lots of information. It's probably, in one way, it's an information overload. People can do online self-diagnosis questionnaires, and that again can be a challenge, because people often become, and not only young people but adults as well, can become rather wedded to a particular diagnosis. They can be convinced that they've got maybe depression, whereas actually when you talk to them and you tease out some of their symptoms, it actually might be that they are bipolar. So, you know, that again can be a bit of a challenge. But I think it's never it's never too much information that's the wrong thing. I think that people must be informed. It's getting the right source of information, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's getting reliable, and it's getting reliable information, and information that has been put there by people who are not charlatans. It's very easy to get drawn when you're looking in the internet and you're Googling, and you can go down a rabbit hole, and you can come across diagnoses that may be quite scary and quite frightening. So I think it's about having websites that are reliable and safe. That's important, and that to me, I think, is one of the important things about education and knowledge availability.
Definitely, I think you've when addressing that, it is very true. I guess it's the issue of the source, I guess, as opposed to the issue of having too many to draw from. It's making sure that it is the reliable one, and something that's helpful and worded in a way that isn't, like you say, going to frighten people off from potentially more not to say more complex, but lesser known terms in mental health diagnoses. And I think that anecdote you gave about people not really even understanding what operations they've had compared to now, where you might have some people actively seeking quite a specific diagnosis in order to access treatment, it really does show the big sort of cultural shift we've had over the past maybe 40, 50 years or so, I guess, medically. But looking at the service users, especially in young people, and maybe being seen as having less reliable viewpoints, I don't suppose you had anything you wanted to add there, Bry, about maybe accessing services as a young person and feeling that your viewpoint was treated well or not so well?
Yeah, I think you can sometimes there's definitely more of a barrier, I think, at times between sort of being a young service user and the sort of clinicians within the service, because not only is there that age barrier, there's also the professional barrier, and I think it makes it more difficult to have that good professional relationship. But I think the main thing for me when talking about this whole collaborative approach and things is understanding where each person within this sort of circle of, I guess, experts in a way, is understanding where their expertise lies. So, for example, the young person, although they may not have the best understanding of the sort of psychiatric side of things, they have the best understanding of themselves. They know themselves better than the psychiatrist does.
Yeah.
The psychiatrist might have a better understanding of the medical side. The parent might have an understanding of sort of like external behaviours and things like that sometimes the young people might not recognise. And it's about working all of these different areas of expertise together to form the whole picture. So I think it's understanding that each individual person has their own expertise and thinking about how we can work all of those together to get the best outcome.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, as you say, the parents know the child better than anybody, and the service user knows themselves better than anybody, and I think that's so important. And I've always said that to my patients, with children and parents, if something isn't right. You know when somebody is different, their behaviour is different, or they are physically different. You know that better than the doctor, and to be honest, it can be really difficult to overcome those professional barriers. You do see parents sadly having to take their kids over and over again to the same doctor, or they choose to go to different doctors because maybe they feel the first one hasn't listened, and so they choose another one, and then they choose another one, and it can be, and it is, extremely frustrating. And that's before you even get to trying to access secondary care services. That's sort of just at the general practice level.
I think that's been covered very well between you two there, in sort of addressing, I guess, the multifaceted approach to services we can have when taking everyone's views into consideration. And I guess looking on that, I think we've already touched on, I guess, the pressure of the diagnosis and sort of what happens next. But do you think we'd be able to have just maybe a discussion around sort of the effects on sort of the stigma that it may have, I guess, depending on each person? So maybe, for example, the stigma faced by a service user, maybe how that would differ to the stigma of a professional who's maybe suffering with it, or the professional who's a parent of someone who's struggling with a mental health condition.
Yeah, and I think stigma is such an important thing to consider, and sadly there is still a huge stigma when it comes to mental health, and it's awful that in the 21st century we're even talking about it, quite honestly. But yes, it does exist. Healthcare professionals still hide themselves when they become unwell, mentally ill. We do have, as doctors, a very good service now that we can access, and it's actually been commissioned and paid for by the NHS, and quite rightly so, because healthcare professionals have a much higher incidence of problems with depression and drugs and alcohol than other professions. It's much higher. And even so, people are still ashamed to access that service. They feel somehow that they've failed, they feel they're weak, they feel they should have been able to keep going, and all of that. And it's the same also with people who are not in the medical profession. And I know I've spoken to lots of people who have found it very difficult to accept a mental health diagnosis. They would far rather have somebody say that the reason why you feel your heart beating very fast in your chest and you're short of breath is because it's a heart problem, not that actually it's anxiety. Or the reason why you feel sick and you have a constant headache and you can't get out of bed because you feel tired is, they'd far rather somebody said, well, maybe you're anemic or something like that, rather than actually you're depressed. So it is still hard for people to receive that diagnosis, and it's so important for the people who are supporting them to try and be, I think, don't be judgmental, be supportive, accept it as a diagnosis in the same way that you would accept them if they had a physical diagnosis. Because I think there is just, even if you're the service user, you've got your parents and your carers to try and help support you, and if there's that stigma, then you're going to feel awkward about talking to them about it, and maybe you might have actually accessed the service and accessed treatment, etc. But if you can't talk to the people that are close to you, it makes it a very lonely journey, and it probably means that you'll have maybe less chance of a good recovery than you would do if you were actually able to share it with those that are closest to you. It makes it easier to bear. So it's so important that the whole of society have that change in attitude, and really I would like to see high profile people who, maybe they're influencers on social media and people like that, stop behaving as though you're having the most fantastic time all the time. Just be honest, life isn't all roses, and just be honest. And it would be nice to see people open up about their own mental health.
It's so true, and I think I know it can often be people within certain professions that are perhaps more honest and open than others, and not in sort of trying to blame any other professions. But I think I know in past podcasts or whatever, where we've looked at sort of the idea of mad pride almost. We've, I think, tried to come up and formulate sort of examples of people who've gone in, as it were, public with their mental health. The main people that come to mind tend to be, I guess, more artists, musicians, sort of things. And I guess with that side, maybe it's because they have that greater sort of freedom with that, the greater autonomy to express this. Maybe it's more expected, and that's what people are happy with, because I know you were saying how there is actually a very high rate of mental health struggles and issues within the healthcare profession, which does make so much sense when it is such a high pressure and demanding job, and working with people and supporting people so much. It only makes sense really that there is sort of that take and that give, and it is very reassuring to hear that there are services out there to be accessed. And I know it does, in terms of that stigma, it does make me think of like friends I've known who've maybe struggled with their mental health, going into sort of like medical training or med school, and who have purposefully hidden this, kept it silent, or refused to access services so it couldn't be viewed on an NHS record because they didn't want this to be then held against them. Or people maybe getting into jobs within health and social care who've got in and then later on disclosed a diagnosis and were told, well, if we'd known this earlier, we might not have actually wanted to hire you as much, but now you're
terrible.
here. I guess we'll try and keep you to stay. It's sort of that idea of almost it's almost sort of seen as that's an obstacle, I guess, and it's sort of, well, if it's here, we'll deal with it, but we'd rather not have to deal with it if we didn't have to.
It shouldn't be like that, should it? And I think the other thing is, it goes hand in hand with the stigma, is that it's hidden. It's not something visible, is it? And I know it's a sort of trotted out sort of sentence, but if someone's broken a leg, you can see it, you can give them sympathy, you can give them support. Nobody has a problem with that. But when somebody has depression or anxiety or PTSD or whatever it might be, you can't see it. You can only see it when they have, if you like, an episode of whatever it might be. But a lot of people, they can control it. You know, I've heard again this sort of thing so many times from patients where they'll say, I don't want to go into my local supermarket because I might meet somebody that I work with and they won't understand why I'm able to go to a supermarket. How can I actually be having time off work with depression and yet I'm able to go and do my shopping? Well, if you had a broken leg, you'd have to go and do some shopping somehow, wouldn't you? Or you get someone to do it for you, okay? But you know, there are physical illnesses which you would still be able to go out and about and actually do the essential things that you'd need to do. And people will say, look, I just feel that if I'm seen, they'll think of me as a fraud. They'll think as though you're not really ill, you should be at work. And it's little things like that, again, it's about changing society's attitude. And I guess the good thing about what you do and about things like this, you know, the podcast, is very, very slowly we're changing things one little bit at a time. And you've got to come at it from so many different angles. It's about employers changing the way in which they look at things. It's about government looking at the way in which they look at things. It's about the health service changing. Even the armed forces, you know, they've had to change. I didn't mention, but before, many years ago, I used to be a GP working in the armed forces, and when I first joined the particular base that I was working on, I remember the people in the medical centre said to me, well, your predecessor used to treat people with psychiatric illnesses by giving them, and this is how long ago it was, by giving them 2p, because that's how much you needed to put in the phone box to call the Samaritans, and that was what he used to do. And I started this job and I uncovered so many people who had significant and less significant, but really quite significant mental health issues that were too ashamed to admit it. They were continuing to work. Worryingly, they were continuing to be deployed overseas. So this was in the time of the first Gulf War. And a lot of them were getting ready to be deployed in that particular war. And then there were people who were again working with really significant depressive illnesses, who had spoken to me about wanting to self-harm, who were being given live weapons and actually working on the front sort of what we call the guard room, which is the front door of the particular base, there to guard people going on and off the base with a live weapon. So there was a significant amount of work that needed to be done, and by the time I'd finished, I had a bit of a reputation because I did get people to front up and admit that they had a problem, and that meant that caused a lot of problems for things like deployment. So I get all the senior officers coming to say, look, what's happening? I haven't got enough people to deploy to the Gulf. Well, sorry, but they're not fit to go. You can't send them. So that's how far we've come. And I think the armed forces are a lot better now. Actually, they're quite sensitive, believe it or not. They have moved on.
Oh, it's good to hear that these, like you were saying, these little steps, these advancements are being made. Because I guess it's sort of that move towards an overall shift, and I think it's sort of looking at getting to that tipping point, I guess, of getting that 51% of the population who understand and are able to know about it, to get it into the majority, into the mainstream, and hopefully see suddenly a big tidal wave of effects in hopefully neutralising a lot of these still very unhelpful and problematic stigmas that surround just at the end of the day, accessing what is healthcare,
exactly,
to put it very bluntly. And I think with looking at that, it sort of just showed the effects of, I guess, the knowledge that people do have of mental health, whether it's in clinically or whether it's just their everyday Joe, as it were, and sort of like the effects of work on it, and whether or not you're then having to sort of actively suppress what you do know, whether you would then be shunned as seen as someone who's strange for wanting it, because I think, like you were saying, it's almost seen as you have to prove how unwell you are, to the apps, like really show like the worst possible times that you could have in order to be seen as someone who is worthy, I guess, of sympathy and support. And then at that point, people don't really want to see you too much, because it's like, you're very unwell now. That you've proved your point. You can go away and sort it now. And I sort of, people are then looking for it to just be magic wands swished and gotten rid of. And it's sort of, well, if we were able to address it and recognise these maybe smaller symptoms, the smaller areas, as it were, if it's a snowball effect, before it sort of turns into something that's going to require more significant maybe adjustments at work or ongoing therapies and access to treatment. If we can address it earlier, recognise it earlier and validate it, then we're not going to have to see these more negative times of people just sort of dropping off a cliff edge, I guess.
Yeah, you can nip it in the bud, can't you? And prevention is better than cure. And ideally what you would try to do for the majority of people, as you say, is diagnose them earlier or get them help earlier, and avoid, if possible, going down that medical model of treatment. Obviously, some people do need it, and it's where it's appropriate, it's very, very effective, but you would rather people had the opportunities to have talking therapy, whether it be reflective counselling, where you sit down and you talk to somebody and you just get some support that way, or whether it be more directive with cognitive behavioural therapy, which is where you try and get people to think in a more positive way and turn that negative way of thinking round into a positive paradigm. But if people do need treatment, as in tablets, or whether it be more significant treatment, then so be it. But ideally, you want to try and prevent, don't you? You want to try and stop people going or needing that particular route if possible.
Yes, definitely. Oh, Bry, I see you lighting up the room. Do you want to add something to the debate?
Yeah, I was just going to go off the back of kind of what Anne-Marie just said there, and I think sometimes when we're talking about mental health, there's almost this unspoken rule that you have to prove that you're ill, that you're ill, especially for accessing treatment. I know sort of if you're taking time off work to go and access treatment, and doing that sort of comparison to physical health as well. If you, for example, needed to go to hospital for a hospital appointment to, I don't know, check out your eyes or so, I don't know, ears or whatever, there would be no queries over it. But if you're asking to take time off work to go and access some sort of therapy or things like that, I think there's that misconception that it's not as important. And like I say, you have to almost prove that you're bad enough, and the fact that you can, like you mentioned, oh sorry, I'm by a window, so sorry if you can hear cars going past. But there's that misconception that you've got to prove that you're bad enough, and well, you can't be at work and also, you know, needing help for mental health service, for a mental health condition and things like that. And I think in order to get the help, sometimes you have to also be at breaking point, which shouldn't be how it should be. Like we say, the prevention and early interventions are definitely more useful and will help people in the long run, and will allow services to, you know, be less, especially the higher level services. I know for children and young people, CAMS are really long waiting lists and things like that. So if we were able to work with schools and things like that to get those early interventions, it would be a lot better. And I do think we're getting there, but there is still that slight idea that, oh, you're just a bit sad, and you have to almost do something drastic to prove that you're really ill, which shouldn't be the way that it is. And then it ends up that people get to the point where they're really ill, and then it's too late in some instances.
I think that's so true, Bryony. That's so true, because I've witnessed that where children and young adults would be told, look, you know, it's a normal part of being a teenager. Yes, you know, your emotions will be a bit all over the place. You will feel a bit up and down, and you know, of course, you know, you're going through puberty, so therefore it's natural, it's normal. Yes, it might be, but it would be so much more helpful if you could get some help as you're going through that change in your life. And yes, for most people, they will get through it and they will be fine. But for a lot, it will lead to more serious illness. So why don't we just give people support at that stage rather than waiting until they get really, really ill? And I think I think once somebody's told, look, it's normal, you're going through puberty, it's normal to sort of shut a few doors loudly and stomp around and be tearful, etc., then people do feel unvalidated, so therefore they won't ask again. If they've asked for help once and they've been told that, they won't come back and ask for it again. So we need more, I think you said early interventions. I think that's a good way of putting it. We need more early interventions for people who are at that stage. It shouldn't be stigmatised that you go and access those services. You know, in actual fact, everybody ought to have access to a counsellor. Why is it such a big deal? Why do you have to be depressed to go and see a counsellor? We all come across difficult decisions in our lives and challenges of all sorts. Let's have everybody have that ability to access some counselling and some direction and support when they need it. They might not be depressed, but you know, might just help them get over a blip, and that then stops them getting to the stage where they need more intervention. Of course, it costs money, and you know, I'm mindful of the fact I work for the health service, so yes, that's the next thing people are going to say. Well, yes, in an ideal world, everyone could have access to a counsellor. That would be fab. But how much is it going to cost? Well, I think you would probably find, if you did the maths, it would cost less in the long run, because what you would be doing is you would be needing less crisis intervention. You'd probably need less in the way of beds, you know, physical beds in hospitals, the way you had to admit people. You'd probably need less long-term more intensive interventions, because again you would have nipped things in the bud. But the problem is that we do commission things in the health service in a very short-termist way, and mental health is no different. So we tend to look at the wrong end of the telescope, so to speak. We look at what we're treating now rather than actually put the money into the prevention side of the equation, and actually you wouldn't need to put the sort of money in the treatment side of things. I mean, diabetes is a good example. If we actually looked at the causes, the underlying causes of diabetes, and put money in that, we wouldn't be spending huge amounts of money on drugs. But that's my personal belief. I don't know whether we're going to get to that stage anytime soon.
But it's always good to have that vision, isn't it? Have that hope. There's no point living just accepting things the way that they are, because then no change will ever get done.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast. Part 2 will be up shortly in the next few days.